come. I haven't read it yet, but it sounds interesting from what Laura Snow has told me. Last week's attendance was 49 adults and children with an offering of $136 that was shared with the Jail Chaplaincy Fund. This week's collection will go to our Sustainability Fund for the maintenance of our building and grounds. And with that, a couple of little ladies and I are going to adjourn to do something more interesting. So.
Still hoping to get a stool of exactly the right size. This is my Pam imitation. We ring the gong 3 times. Once for those who came before us and made a place for us. Once for those who are here now. And once for those who will follow and build on the dream. As we light our chalice this morning, let us remember that it is a privilege to give to one another. Let us appreciate the love and opportunities for growth from accepting and passing on the many blessings we have both given and received here. May we honor this joy in our relationships with each other and in realizing and expanding our dream with the world. Please join me in reading or speaking the Unison Covenant, which is printed on the screen and in the order of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. Our offertory words today come to us from Helen Johnson Fay. The offering is the sacrament of the free church. It is supported by the voluntary generosity of all who join with us. The offering will now be given and received in grateful appreciation of our shared hopes and values. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you today, or reintroduce to you today, Carolyn Gardner Hunt, who is a longtime friend of UUFE and a licensed pastor in the Indiana-Michigan Conference Mennonite Church, USA. She and her husband Anthony moved here 16 years ago. While Anthony currently is the director of WVPE, our local NPR station, the couple met at a public radio station where Carolyn already was working. They have 4 boys, one of which went to OWL classes here several years ago. OWL stands for Our Whole Lives. Most recently, Carolyn was serving at Prairie Street Mennonite Church. We are very happy to welcome back to our pulpit Reverend Hunt as she speaks to us about gratitude or thanksgiving. Welcome, Carolyn.
I didn't know that you had a step stool. I could have worn flats. I wore heels, so. No, I move around too much when I talk, and I'm afraid I'm gonna fall off your step stool. So, this is a big stack of paper, but that's just because I printed it really big for my eyes, so don't worry. Have you been looking at your mail lately? Near the end of the calendar year, every not-for-profit organization, including churches, worshiping communities, everyone's making the budget for next year. And so we all want to talk about stewardship. And you might think I have some nerve asking to talk to you about money because I'm not a pastor here, but I thought we'd just live dangerously today. So stewardship is about more than money. It's about caring for all we have been given in the context of community. And in the United States, fall harvests or our idealization of, a few generations ago, bygone rhythm of life, often prompt expressions of these sentiments in November. And every culture and faith tradition includes practices of gratitude and thanksgiving, even Facebook. Who has friends here that observe November as 30 days of gratitude? Maybe people are, they're posting like a hashtag thankful. They're gonna make a post and kind of discipline themselves to talk about something that they are grateful for every day. A photo or a few sentences of reflection. And that is a really helpful spiritual practice for anyone, because it's really easy to be ungrateful and focus on what we don't have, overlooking what we do have. Personally, I have a problem with envy. I live on the cheap side of East Jackson, so I look at the houses across, and I imagine, I waste a lot of my time and energy on what they appear to have and why I don't have it. So cultivating this habit of being grateful is good for us and those around us. But I want to talk about the difference between gratitude and thanksgiving. Gratitude is primarily an internal realization. Like it's something you can do by yourself. You can sit there and you're going to call to mind blessings you've been given. It doesn't take place purely in the present because everything that we're grateful for, everyone we're grateful for, has come from the past in some sense, right? Via our ancestors. It could be the person who built our house, the person who created the infrastructure so we could have indoor plumbing and electricity. Our food, clothing, and shelter are most often resulting from the work of others, whether it be farm laborers, or those who build and repair your home. There's always an aspect of history and gratitude, and kind of behind that, you always have the big stories that you use to shape your understanding of the world and give meaning to your life. But you can feel grateful by yourself. Like it's something you don't have to have a community to do. You could just sit there and be grateful. And if there is any movement of emotional energy present in gratitude, it's vertical. It's like between you and the spirit or God or the universe, however it is that you experience the creating spirit. Gratitude is a noun, and it's something you can experience in stillness without any skin in the game. Thanksgiving, by definition, involves action and relationship. Now, I know in our culture here, Thanksgiving this time, we usually are thinking about it as a noun, right? It's the day, it's the meal. Could be a type of prayer, the civic holiday, but even in noun form, there's a verb in it, and you all know from Schoolhouse Rock that verbs are action, right? So Thanksgiving requires a giver and a recipient. This is a horizontal expression. It's going to be between human beings, a giving of ourselves and our resources in a way that will materially, physically bless others. Sharing the fruits of our labor is a valid and necessary form of worship described in both the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, and in many, many other sacred writings. But I want you to tell me the truth now. This is the thing that's been scaring me about this sermon. When was the last time you had someone read from the Old Testament in your congregation? Don't worry about a couple weeks ago? Okay, I was really afraid you guys might run me out on a rail because I'm going to read a longer bit than maybe normally you would even hear. Wait and see. Okay. Let me get my puppets out and maybe it will make it more palatable. So I want to do this because the connection between worship and sharing the things you've worked for undergirds a lot of Western assumptions about Thanksgiving. And this is from Deuteronomy 26. I think you'll be able to tell the parts that I paraphrased when I get there. In that part of the Hebrew scriptures, there's like 25 chapters of this long list of rules and all the things you can do and you can't do, and it goes on and on and on. But then you get to this little chapter, and in the Bible I looked at, it said liturgical declarations. That means things you're going to say in worship. And it's written as if Moses is telling them to the people. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and when you possess it and settle in it, take some of the first of all the fruits of the ground, which you harvest from the land given to you. I want you to put it in a basket and go to the place that we set aside for worship and say to the priest who's in office there, today I declare that I have come into this land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. And this is like a formula that was expected that people maybe from each family would say as they brought their first fruits. And as each of them does that, the spiritual leader receives their basket and places it at the foot of the altar. And then the giver recites this little summary, a history of the people of Israel. Basically, our ancestors came from humble beginnings. They emigrated to another country. They grew in number and power, but they were forced into slavery and made to forfeit their property and their land. Generations passed, but with signs and wonders, the Lord brought them to a land flowing with milk and honey, fertile land that could support animals and birds and pollinating insects and crops. So there's that little summary, and then the person says, "Now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that is given to me." And the narrator, Moses, says, "Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord has given you." I've heard this summary described in even fewer words as, "They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat." And there are three things to note here. That first of all, the person giving those first fruits is not giving up something, because this story says that after they offer it, you're going to enjoy it together, right? Like you still are benefiting from that. And second, there's no indication from the text that, like, it doesn't say these crops will be taken off to the market and sold at whatever is the going rate, and the funds generated will be used to pay for the salary of the priest and the heating bill of the temple. It doesn't say that. And third, the groups of people who were described as celebrating with you were those who by law or tradition could not own land. Now, they mentioned two of them here: Levites, which would be the temple priests or the clergy, the spiritual leaders. One of the 12 tribes of Israel that didn't have territory allotted to them, and I don't know why. I tried to find out for you, but I couldn't. It's just one of those rules. Who knows? And then the aliens who live among you. That means people who recently immigrated here. Well, they might one day own property, but they just got here. If they made that journey, they probably fled some danger or famine. They haven't been here long enough to plant crops yet. And other people mentioned later who benefit from these offerings are widows and orphans. Again, people who by law could not own property and could not grow, could not provide for themselves. They need the produce that is physically brought into the place of worship. They need that person who still has dirt under their fingernails when they bring in that basket. Rabbinic literature, like commentaries on the scriptures, states that the first fruits offerings were made of 7 species that were native to the land: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. And I find that, like, it's so specific. Like, if you look at those things and you think, well, even if all you had to eat was those 7 things, plus you could probably find greens that were edible or things that grew wild, you would do okay. It kind of sounds like an ideal vegan diet somebody would write a book about now. So these temple offerings provided a basic level of sustenance for everyone in the community. And they provided a way to enjoy that sustenance together. And these offerings didn't take place only at the big worship site, like the big temple in Jerusalem, because a few paragraphs down after what I read to you, there's a little note that says, oh, don't forget, in your own little villages, like, figure out a system where once every 3 years you're going to give 1/10 of your produce. And I guess they work it out amongst themselves, which farmer does which year. But there's also provision for in that area where you live. There's a system to receive offerings and share them. So all over the world, societies make provision for the least of these. And sometimes that provision is organized and it's a direction, like we saw in Deuteronomy, but other times it's more of a disposition, an attitude. And I have a couple of stories. These were gathered by North American church workers who went and lived in other countries, so they were gathered in that context, but they're not grounded in explicit Christian doctrine. So I think they provide an interesting, not an opposite view, just an enlarged view. So this North American church worker lived in rural Lesotho, a village in Lesotho in southern Africa. And she recalled this instance, told it to a friend of hers. So the church worker's name is Brenda. Brenda was going to visit her friend who lived across the village, and when she arrived at a friend's house, Brenda found her friend at a table in the courtyard cutting up a pumpkin. The story does have the friend's name, but I did not know how to pronounce it, so I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I'm just going to keep calling her the friend. It was early winter, right about the time it is here. It was pumpkin harvest time. And since pumpkins keep well, they are the main vegetable that the Basotho, the people who live in Lesotho, eat during the winter. And they were commiserating with each other. What a bad pumpkin harvest, her friend said to Brenda after they'd exchanged greetings. You know, more than half of the pumpkins rotted in my field, and these 8 are the only ones that I have to keep for the winter. So they visited and they talked about other things, and then sometime later, Brenda got up to leave, and her friend reached for one of the largest pumpkins and handed it to her. Well, you can't give me this pumpkin, Brenda protested. You just told me that these 8 are all you have. And her friend laughed. She said, we Basotho know that this is the way to do it. Next year, I may have nothing in my field. And if I don't share with you now, who will share with me then? Still smiling, she took the pumpkin back and cut it in half. Here, she said, you take this half and give the other half to your next door neighbor. You know, go well, have a nice day. Now, this sharing of pumpkins was not grounded in a doctrinal statement of faith. And I read this story in a church cookbook, so if the friend who grew the pumpkins had said, I give you this pumpkin to show you God's love, or Jesus tells us to give food to the hungry, the publisher would have had every reason to include that. This story shows that the community in Lesotho prioritized sharing of resources before need was demonstrated. That's what I found interesting. It's not just, oh, I heard you have company, would you like a pumpkin? It's, I'm going to give this to you because this ensures that you don't have need. And in the future, like now I've established a relationship with you. In the future, if I have a need, you will wish to reciprocate. So the way that this community prioritized sharing of resources was a way of nourishing those relationships as well as our stomachs, because we need both of those things. And here's a story from another culture. This is from Peru, and the story was written in the 1980s. Some of the language that is used in it we probably wouldn't use today, but I'm going to read it to you as it was written. And this actually was published in an academic journal about the different cultures that are in the Andes. Quechua-speaking Indians in the Peruvian Andes use centuries-old communal forms of working the land and distributing the harvest so that the entire community is nourished. During the years when some families do not harvest enough to eat, the community organizes an ancient feast called Collecting Food to Promote Life. They gave the word in Quechua, but I do not speak that, so. The feast takes place at the home of the needy family. The family appoints one member, usually a woman, to serve as the host. The host prepares chicha, a strong corn drink, not corn liquor, but the grain drinks that are common in Latin America. So you prepare the corn drink, and the host provides a basket, again, for measuring out the products that are donated during the feast. And she spreads out a huge poncho or shawl in the family's patio where the food will be collected. As neighbors come to contribute something, the host welcomes them and offers them a glass of chicha. And after the visitors place their gifts in the basket, the host awards each basketful with another 2 glasses of chicha. Word spreads quickly that the family is serving good chicha and encouraging others to come to share. When the poncho is full, the host calls the family to collect and store the provisions. First, they gather around the poncho, they bless the crops, and they give thanks. This feast embodies the solidarity expressed in a common saying, today this is for you, tomorrow it may be for me. And this sentiment is similar to that of our Lesotho friend, on the other side of the world, but it includes a celebratory aspect, and it ascribes dignity to the family in need. Someday we're going to be the one in need, and wouldn't it be nice if we were treated well, not simply as a recipient, but also as the host, someone who has prepared and serves. We all benefit from being a community that gives. And a side note here, the author who describes this leveling feast refers to centuries-old communal practices of farming. And I might be reading between the lines, but I'm betting this means older than the era of colonialism. So it's predating the violent imposition of Christianity on indigenous peoples of South America. So this method, this attitude is not indebted to, it doesn't derive from Judeo-Christian ethics. The practice of collecting food to promote life reminds me of rent parties. Honestly, I have never attended one. I've only read about them and seen them in old movies, so I wanted to know if any of you have ever been to one. Has anyone been to a rent party? Okay. So I've read about this. I'm pretty sure there's one mentioned in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, but I learned about them from old black and white movies. And when I was trying to read it, I thought, oh, did I just imagine this? Let me figure this out. Rent parties originated in Harlem in the 1920s. They are traceable to a specific region and time when the Great Migration brought hundreds of thousands of black families from the South to northern urban areas for jobs. Discriminatory practices turned out not to be limited to the South. Black workers were usually paid less than white workers and charged higher rents for their housing. And rent parties were a way to raise the difference because so many people consistently had, there was just no way. It was a predatory rent practice. The person who needed their rent to be, they're not asking someone to pay their whole rent. They're saying, I got to make up this little bit here. They were a way to raise the difference. If you were the host, you made home-cooked food. Maybe some of your friends helped you with that. You provided liquor, even during Prohibition, so this is another reason why they were popular. And usually had live music for dancing. And this was news to me, but a lot of jazz styles, stride piano, styles like the Lindy Hop, styles of dancing, those developed out of rent parties. And even artists that we know that later became famous, like Fats Waller and James P. Johnson, they performed at rent parties all the time, sometimes more than one a night if they could get different gigs. So the guest would pay to attend, but much less than you would pay if you went to a nightclub. And many of the nightclubs wouldn't have let you in if you were black anyway. So rent parties were a creative way to circumvent unfair systems and provide a way to celebrate together. They met both monetary and relational needs. In my imagination, the wood floors of the apartments where people have moved back the furniture and they've rolled up the rugs, those became fertile ground for new styles of music and dance to flourish. But that was a bonus. The original idea was people engaging in a coordinated activity to provide each other's necessities. And, they found a way to celebrate while doing it. And the New York Times reported in 2009 that during the recession that was going on at that time, 2008, 2009, the idea of rent parties came back in New York and persisted for a year or two as people that maybe were gig workers or people that used to be paid on commission for something didn't have what they needed. And then we know that again during COVID, people, musicians, artists found ways to do streaming. That's basically like a rent party, but it's online. You found ways to do it without cramming everybody into your apartment. So that concept does persist. It's pretty easy to see fundraising meals as the modern day analog of rent parties. Come eat spaghetti to support the American Legion, and then in turn the Legion supports a local scout troop. Buy fried fish dinners to help a family pay funeral costs for their matriarch. Or heck, just straight up give money through a GoFundMe to help someone with medical expenses. These are common, and even if it's a fundraising meal, I know that people are sitting together, but somehow those ways of sharing costs seem remote. If I go help at the fish fry at the Legion because my Cub Scout pack benefits, there are hundreds of people in there. They're having a good time, but they're not related to, and they don't know anything about what the Legion is using that money for necessarily. They're just there for fish and a beer. So the leveling feast that we heard about in the Andes, though, hosted by your auntie or your grandma, that feels personal. So what would we bring in our baskets if we were invited to a leveling feast? Do we have that photo that I sent you that was of the butternut squash? I should have warned you. I thought it was just going to be up there, and I was just going to point, and it was already going to be there. Sorry. All right. So my friend Dana in Virginia would probably bring butternut squash if she got invited to a leveling feast, because that is her garden produce. Her family has a little garden. There's just 3 of them. They did not intend to feed the whole neighborhood, but they ended up being able to. But, for most of us in Elkhart County, if you look at how we're employed, people make RV components or assemble electronics. In my neighborhood, there's people building apartments, upgrading sewer pipes, and installing fiber optic cable. So setting onto the poncho on the ground, the goods and products that we make would not really help the widows and orphans. Really wouldn't help those whose crops didn't grow this year, because you can't eat electronics. You can't pay someone's rent with the medical devices made down on Middlebury Street at the Phillips Health and Ears. You can't clothe someone with a radio program, or a book you've written, or a bunch of squash. And that's why sharing and thanksgiving in our culture always involves giving money, even if we don't have a lot of money ourselves. This is part of the love people of goodwill show each other, caring for each other's bodily needs, food, clothing, and shelter, as if they were our own, because we are each other's own. We are each other's own. We recommit ourselves to this idea. Your congregation does this every time you gather. You choose to show up here, to be part of this fellowship, to sing, to speak, to listen, to give thanks. Your thanksgiving is not only words, but also action. And implicit in that giving of money, that action, is your recitation of the circumstances and experiences that got you there. You are probably going to use different words than the ones we heard in Deuteronomy. And they might be something, the full truth of them known only to you. They might be something you do not speak out loud. But your story is there, and you are putting it in the basket. You are offering yourself every time there's an offering received here. Now, however it is that you place your funds at the service of the congregation, you might have a monthly debit set up that goes from one bank account to another, and you never even put anything in that plate or that basket. Maybe you Venmo, maybe you have Square here, I don't know. Do you do that where you can just swipe your card? But however it is, if it's abstract or if it's concrete, that you're placing your funds at the service of the congregation, you're basically taking them and placing them at this altar, like the first fruits were placed in a big basket. That money puts food in the mouth of a child. It places a roof over the head of somebody who has suddenly become unhoused. It wraps warm clothing around a person for whom Elkhart, of all places, is the promised land. Your dollars support and strengthen actual human beings. The offerings you make are a collection to promote life. They are not that different from what the Quechua Indians collected in the Andes. Those offerings are a tender and sacred duty that says we are each other's own. This season and always, give thanks and rejoice together. Amen and amen.
If anyone has a comment, a question, an idea.
That was a very nice sermon. I really enjoyed it.
Was it interesting, do you think, more than what the children are doing? That was really my word.
I was going to say that you've gotten quite a welcome from my wife and myself. She's the one who took the children out, and I'm the one who aimed the leaf blower at you. So
It was memorable. So.
But thank you very much.
Thank you. It is very refreshing to hear your words about giving from outside in, as opposed from inside in. And so it's nice to hear your words and your encouragement for that. Thank you.
Very good point, Pam.
Thanks for being here. It's nice to see you again.
Hey, Dwight.
So we had a care team meeting on Thursday, and the one thing I kept emphasizing is that no one in this country should go hungry or without housing. And yet we have this disparity, this difference in attitude, and I'm just hoping that we can continue to close the gap and be a lot more sharing than we are. We can't go after things anymore. We have to go after the good things in our head and our heart.
And I think, Dwight, like you would probably guess that by giving examples from other cultures, I am implying, a critique of the U.S. system and others. And it's easy for some people to say, well, the churches should do that, or the faith communities, and like that's not fair. That's not everything. That's not ideal. But if as a small, tight group of people who care for one another, body and soul, that is one thing we can do. I read that in your hymnal. I was reading these prayer texts here before, that even if I can only do one thing, I'm not going to neglect that one thing. I'm going to do it.
Thank you very much for your thoughts and comments. I appreciate your 2 or 3 references to the indigenous peoples. That's where my thoughts go in Thanksgiving, and today starts, I guess it started early because it's about Thanksgiving and giving, but I'm sure they have a completely different perspective of some of these things than we do.
Yeah.
I always know it's a wonderful service when I get my pen out and start taking notes. And I really appreciated you separating and defining gratitude and Thanksgiving and the differences. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
it
you're
was
welcome.
a wonderful service. Thank you.
Yeah, my comments follow on hers. I appreciated the separating the definitions. It's something I always appreciate and understand about our language. But at the same time, there is a relationship between gratitude and Thanksgiving.
Oh, yes.
Thanksgiving starts with gratitude.
Yes.
If you don't have gratitude and appreciate what you have nothing to share.
Definitely.
So, yeah, and I was also thinking about, your examples are mostly community-based and such, and worship-based, but the idea of how does that relate to Social Security, for example?
Yeah.
But also you mentioned that in modern day, not everyone is raising crops.
Yeah.
But your crop is your income.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you do, whether it's boring in a fiber optic, whether it's building a wall, you are fertilizing something that produces for you a crop of income, which is what you share.
Yes.
Yes, thank you for the message today. I'm not a scholar of the Bible. I'm going to ask you this question. What does the Bible say about the balance of sharing for those who are more fortunate than others?
I'm not a scholar of the Bible either, but I might have read it a little bit more than you, but yeah, there are parts that there are places that I think what I can say in general is that when people are described as having wealth or having money, that there's always an obligation for care for the community that's attached to that. And in the New Testament, I'm not even going to know exactly where, but so in the New Testament, there are books, I think this is going to be in the book of Acts, where there's stories of some of the first worshiping communities. You know, and there was a married couple that are named in there that were asked to contribute money for something, and the way the story goes is they hid some of their income, and they didn't admit to having as much as they had. Well, in the story, they're both struck down dead like the next week, you know, and that was given as a lesson that, like, that's not typical, and that's just one little incident. But I think it lines up that if you have plenty, then look around and see who doesn't. And we know now, after COVID and after other things, that part about it's for you today, it might be for me tomorrow, that's really true. You know, there are people that saw severe instant financial reversals, or, I mean, gosh, if I had to retire tomorrow, the stock market would not be good news, you know, for our family. So when you have, I think there's you know, the Bible's not one book, it's lots of books written by lots of people. But I'd say that there are impulses both in the Jewish faith and in the Christian faith of using what you have to care for others. In Islam, too, I mean, almsgiving is one of the pillars of Islam. That's something that defines you as a Muslim, that if you are not giving alms, then that's one of the things that you're, like that, it's like missing a leg off your table, you know, it's going to fall over, so, yeah.
I have I have a teenager and a preteen now, and something that we have actually been talking about for about the last month, really in depth, is how little families are sharing stories and culture and things that they went through. And I'm a very firm believer of, if you don't pay attention to history, it's going to repeat itself. And that's something I'm trying to teach my two children, is you can't listen to the stories from the kids at school, and you can't listen to the stuff that you hear on YouTube or social media. You know, you really need to pour it in from the families, so that you know where you need to go in life. And my daughter looked at me and goes, "But Dad, that's old news." And I said, "But old news is going to save you."
Yeah.
And that's something that was really drilled into me as a child. And one thing I used to do when I was real little is, every time that we had to give our time for serving, I would go to nursing homes, and I would play board games or Uno or something, just for stories, because I wanted to hear where they came from, so I knew where I was going.
Good.
And that's something I'm trying to instill into my kids. But I can't believe just how much stories don't resonate anymore. I mean, what does that mean for our future? It's a really scary thought.
In a couple of weeks, we'll be having our bread communion, and that's an opportunity for us each to be sharing something from our history with each other.
Most of you, I think, recognize the name Warren Buffett. I have read in different places that he feels a lot of gratitude because he has a real skill in the financial arena. But he said, if I lived in Ethiopia, and almost, you can name a bunch of countries, my skill would be almost useless,
Yeah.
and I would be one of the poor.
So I think that when I look at religions and religious traditions, the best interpretations of them are the concern for poverty and inequality, and that's like, you know, Jesus, and then you mentioned Islam, and I have some sort of surface level knowledge of Islam, and my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that like it was something that Muhammad was really, really concerned about, and that Islam is really concerned about. And Ramadan, at least part of it, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but is don't eat during daylight hours during Ramadan, and part of that is to remind the worshiper that there are people in the world who don't have enough to eat. Period. Like that's part of the tradition. And I think, and what you pointed to is that obviously there are huge institutional incentives for the inequality in this country, and it's almost, it's just encouraged at this point. But so like the churches can't solve it, we can't solve it. Go vote, please vote. If you haven't voted, vote. And I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. No, so one other thing. So in some of these countries, and like I spoke with someone at length for a long time about life in Iraq, and like what they told me was, you walk into a restaurant, and if you want like a salad and some lentils and rice, you don't have to pay for it. They have places where they put food that's out of the way so that you don't see who's taking it, to make sure that everybody has food. That if in that country, if you had something like Walmart, like they have an understanding that if you employ someone, you have an obligation to make sure that they have housing and food and are taken care of. And when I explained the way that Walmart functions, they told me no one would shop there. They just absolutely, no one, when they found out that like you're not providing adequate wages for your people, no one would shop there. And my point being that there's just this, the term I'm trying to coin is toxic individualism. Is like we just have this, like, in other countries they would be ashamed. We have a third of children in this country that that are in food insecure homes, something like that, and which means there's at least one meal a day where they don't know where it's coming from. And we just sit back and we're like, well, I'm just gonna doom scroll Facebook. Okay, cool. I'm gonna watch Fox News all day. I mean, come on, man. How are we not ashamed of what goes on?
I think we're going to let Annette have the last word today.
First of all, thank you, friend, for being here. Anyway, what I was thinking when Chuck asked the question about how much to give, I was thinking of the story of the widow that gave her last two, or maybe not her last two, but a very small amount, but to her it was a huge amount.
Yeah, the widow's mite, and you know, like, which are like the tiniest little things that, yeah, and but you know, if you, yeah, that she gave from her necessity. She gave, yeah.
Yeah, and how much that giving meant. Whereas if we have more, it's sometimes harder to give, like the quote about the eye of the needle. But I was also thinking something that holds people back from giving is fear. And we need to learn to address that fear that holds us back from being more generous.
I love to quote Red Skelton, who is credited with saying, "Don't give until it hurts. Give until it feels good." Thank you, Carolyn. Our closing hymn is number 348, Guide My Feet. And after the benediction and the postlude, please, as Judy had mentioned, gather the chairs and put them against the walls and the hymn books.